Thanks so much for having me today. I hope I can share some thoughts and ideas with you that get you excited about making fun things in place. No, that's great. That's huge. It's so big. All right, neat. As mentioned, I'm a professor in Honors College. I teach classes over there about generally in the realm of video games and that sort of thing, and then also math classes. I'm originally a number theorist. That's what my PhD is in, and sort of on the way to getting that degree, I fell in line with the wrong group of folks, and since then I've only been doing games and learning stuff. In particular, in the fall, I'm teaching a class that you all might want to sign up for, even if you're not in the Honors College. If this stuff sounds interesting to you, it's sort of an easy way to get credit for exploring that interest. And I'll talk about it in a few minutes. Let's see. Any questions or thoughts before I get going? Once I get going, I get pretty excited, and you'll be lucky if I remember to look up before 3 hours have passed and you're all late for the next event. Any questions or thoughts before I get started? Anything you want to share from your end of things? Yeah?
What's the class?
What's the class? It's called Local Games in Albuquerque. And it's 401 is the number of it. And if you're not in honors, there's some like hoops you have to jump through to sign up, but you can do it. Yeah?
Will you be using 3D Max?
Will I be using what?
3D Max?
I don't know. You can use 3D Max if you want. I don't use 3D Max. I don't know 3D Max. I'd love to know about it, but it's not something that I use. But you don't have to use the things that I use either. So
maybe the question is, what type of programs do you use?
Okay, so I'll talk today about a piece of software that I like to share with people because it's very easy to use. Everyone from middle schoolers to faculty members can use this to make games. And the other thing that's kind of neat about it, maybe for people that are maybe not quite novices in the programming world, is any place you can put text in this app, you can actually open it up to any sort of web stuff, HTML and JavaScript. So anything that you can sort of fit into a web app, you can put inside a window in this software. But you don't have to use this software. Like I was saying, there's lots of other things out there to use. I like to talk about this one because I'm very involved in its development. I've been using it for a long time, and like I said, it's very accessible. And it's also free, so that's nice. Any other questions before we get started? Now, granted, a lot of these details will become clear as I talk probably, but just anything that other people are burning to know? No? All right, so let's get started. So first thing, I guess, to sort of set your palettes is the kinds of places I like to think about these games, like they would be really, really plausible, is a place like the zoo. So a zoo is a place where people go on purpose to kind of hang out. Maybe learn a couple things, wander around. Walking outside in particular is sort of a part of it. And there are things to see and do there, but also there's a real potential to, like what if the tiger is sleeping? What do you really get to know about the animals from the little bit that you see there and the plaques that are there? How involved are you, or who do you get to be when you go to the zoo? These are all potential spaces for exploration for designers in the space of augmented reality. You can take the zoo and turn it into a brand new world using what's already there. And so as I drone on about the things that I think are important, this might be a fun example to think of in the back of your mind. You could leave this room today and go make a game that takes place at the zoo, that a ton of people have fun without any background or preparation or anything like that. You could just do it. So start brainstorming while I'm talking, I guess is what I'm saying. That's the general idea of where these things might exist in the wild and where they would be fun. Another bit of background for me, like I said, I'm a mathematician, and this is the environment that I trained to operate in. And anywhere in the world, from the level of like elementary school kids up to graduate students, it looks like this. This is how we choose to sort of organize and spend our time, and it's very limited. There's one person at the front who gets to talk, everyone else writes down exactly what they say in their book, and then it's in another book too. It's not the most, productive use of people in a room together and their time. But if you look at the edges, the things that professional mathematicians and graduate students organize for themselves, it looks very different. This is a photo from something called Arizona Winter School in 2009, sort of my last fling as a mathematician. And there were lectures during the day, but at night, we would all get together in a big conference room and work on unsolved problems together. Try and invent new math that hadn't been invented before. It's very collaborative. And so this sort of basic disconnect and dissatisfaction with what my future life as a mathematician was going to be is what led me to explore these spaces of games and learning. And ultimately, I don't think it's about the graphics or the technology, but wanting to create a more productive social space for learning. It's, I don't know, sort of ironic that I'm standing here saying that in front of you when I'm talking, you're all just sitting and listening and taking notes or whatever. But I see that as a starting point. Hopefully it leads to something more collaborative and engaging later on. So those are two bits of sort of background to set the stage for who I am and why I'm bothering with any of this. And hopefully in the next few minutes I can give you some reasons why you might want to bother with it. One is that augmented reality, and I'll talk a little bit about what I think augmented reality is because it's sort of a weird definition that maybe seems a little bit more narrow than it should be. What it serves to do is connect worlds to each other. And the main thing that I see as exciting about this is a chance to have place be at the center of what we build, what we create, what our conversations are in the future in a way that it hasn't been before. And then the other thing that's really exciting, I think you should listen and get excited about this stuff, is almost nothing has been done in this field yet. It's really easy for a really half-assed project to actually go somewhere, which is very different than the field I come from. Number theory has been around for 3,000 years, and you have to train for a long time and be a very specific kind of smart to be able to contribute even the tiniest little bit to that field. But augmented reality is really just getting started. And there's lots of different directions it can go in. And the way it's going to go in those directions is if people like you try some stuff out and share your ideas with other people. So my work with augmented reality begins kind of a long time ago. I think many people, maybe not in this room, but in a lot of rooms, were most familiar with augmented reality starting in the summer, this previous summer with the release of Pokemon Go. But it's a term I've been using and a thing I've been creating for more than a decade now. And this was the first project I worked on. It was a huge educational grant, which isn't huge compared to other amounts of money between 3 different universities. And I was lucky enough, even though I didn't have any technical training, to be a part of this team and get to make games for middle schoolers in Madison and Milwaukee. And the idea behind the grant was to figure out what these mobile devices that were sort of maybe on the cusp of actually being in normal people's hands, but really still a few years away, might be used for in education. What were the affordances of this medium or this format? And what we discovered along the way was that there were some other things that were kind of interesting. We created a couple things that sort of felt like magic and like something new. And the first one, to inspire your design thinking, is something I want to share from the Saving Lake Wingra game. And it's the red-winged blackbird. In this game, the kids have the little devices and they're wandering around looking at the devices, something which we're all now very familiar with as a part of modern life. And then at this one point in the game, they're walking on a narrow boardwalk and they're surrounded by very high cattails. And what the game does is, at a specific set of GPS coordinates, plays for them the song of the red-winged blackbird. And the dynamic that this elicits in play is, instead of looking down and looking at the game, all of a sudden then everyone who played that game stops and listens and realizes that all around them there's all these sounds that were there all along that they weren't paying attention to, and now they are. And so that was one of these first little bits of magic that says there's something special about this format, this medium, this possibility of connecting place with some sort of virtual software design. You can create something that doesn't just stay between the user and the software, but actually goes back out to the place itself. When I got here, I was excited about making games and wanted to find a way to do that at all possible costs, because helping people do number theory, not a lot of people come along on that journey with you. And I ran into another new professor here named Julie Sykes, She was a Spanish professor and had worked in games and learning before. And we thought the idea of having a game that took advantage of place in a real material way and teaching Spanish classes in Albuquerque might be a good way to take that next step. And so we made a game together called Mentira. Yesterday in the talk I was giving, there was actually a student in the audience who had played this game as a part of their Spanish 202 class. Anyone in here actually play Mentira as a part of that course? It would have had to been a couple years ago, well, a few years ago now. But thought I'd check the crowd first. There are still people at this university who've played it. She eventually left to take a job in another state, and of course that made everything go away and crash and burn. But it's sort of a Phoenix story that I might get to later. In any case, Mentira was the idea of saying, hey, we're teaching Spanish in Albuquerque, a place where Spanish has been relevant longer than English, a lot longer than English. So why do we teach it in a classroom at desks and with a textbook the same way we would teach it if we were in Iowa or any other place? Can we take advantage of the fact that we are, sort of in the middle of a world where Spanish exists as a real part of it, as a small part at least of what we do when we're teaching people. So it's a murder mystery. It takes place in the Los Griegos neighborhood, and I'll tell you a little bit more about it later if we get to it. But anyway, I worked on that game, and that really got me going as a professional working outside of the confines of a big grant that people had to bring in. It was just me and Julie, no programmers, a couple grad students, and we put this thing together, and it went pretty far. I also work on projects where the role that these games play isn't as this final artifact that then sort of plays a role like a textbook or something that people play to learn. Often the games and their design play a role in an overall context where people making the game together is the experience that you're trying to create. And this project, the Partnership for Digital Learning and Indigenous Knowledge and Digital Literacies, I always forget the order, was about bringing together university professors that thought they had some idea about how to sort of bring marginalized communities into the 21st century, especially in terms of like what the youth would be learning, and tribal community members who were looking for a way to preserve their way of thinking, their way of life, and especially their language. So we worked with small tribes in Arizona, many of whom have languages that like fewer than a dozen people still speak fluently. And what do those two groups of people know about each other? Almost nothing. I don't know a lot about what those community members are struggling with and what they're after as someone who's played around with games. But what we did is we got together and we played one of these augmented reality games as a way to sort of set things in motion. And then we talked to each other for a day. And then after that, we made a game together as a way to continue that conversation, to actually incorporate in this frame or mold or sort of meta media that is augmented reality games, the things that they cared about, the things that they wanted to talk about, the things that they wanted to do. And then after we left that initial conversation, that game existed as a concrete and bounded idea. They could say, well, what is this project about? Well, we're starting with this thing right here, and you can see this thing. And so we actually got together later and made this game. And that's a very different way that games can fit into an overall picture. And one that I think is worth presenting because there's a lot of momentum in thinking about, oh, well, instead of a textbook, we'll have a game, and sort of that one-for-one replacement idea. But the way that games can create and recreate and fit into social spaces together as a whole can be varied. So it's worth knowing about on the front end. In the course of working on these projects, I ended up getting involved with a software project called Eris. Kind of like KFC, it used to be an acronym, Augmented Reality for Interactive Storytelling, and now it just kind of is the acronym. This is an open source software project that I'll tell you a little bit more about later on, but in making Mentira, as a non-programmer, not being able to hire programmers, I needed something that I could use. And later on, I needed something that I could show other people how to use, and Eris became that thing. And so when it worked for me, learning how to make Mentira, I started working on the project myself, and I've been very involved with it for the last 8 years or so. It's a very fun project. I've met a lot of really cool people and exposed to a lot of new cool ideas by having a chance to work on it. It doesn't have a grant. It doesn't have a PI. It's very weird for an academic project. It's very informal, and that's part of what makes it a lot of fun. As soon as I started getting involved with these, this is the course I told you about, I said, well, why don't I just have my students make these things? I bet they could do at least as good of a job as I can. And so I made a class in honors where the idea was to make mobile games to learn about the city. And I'll be teaching that in the fall, so if you'd like to sign up for it, I would encourage you to. But I would encourage you not to wait for the class to get started with any of this stuff. If you're interested, email me tomorrow, and we'll find something to work on. The idea behind this is just that, and I'm sure you all know this in your class, when you're trying to make something for other people, there's a lot of skills that come into the room. There's a lot of things you could try and work on and try and get better at and use as a chance to learn about teamwork. And so as a activity to ask students to do, making games seems, although very hard, very interesting. It's not just turning a paper in at the end of the semester. And so that was a lot of motivation in adopting this approach, in addition to my own desires to learn about Albuquerque, a city that I grew up in and knew nothing about, in the way that I learned about Madison and Milwaukee and their sewer systems by making games in them. One of the games that came out of that very first class, and is like the sort of second flash of like insight and inspiration and greatness for augmented reality for me personally, was, as I said before, a very half-assed student project by like the worst slacker I ever taught. It was called Digital Graffiti Gallery. He didn't care about graffiti, he didn't know about graffiti. He was looking for a project to do at the very end of class after having been in there all semester and not really done anything. And the other students who knew about graffiti and were talking about it in terms of it being an interesting thing in the city and the difference between graffiti and murals and different art styles and stuff. And he picked up on it and said, well, okay, what if we could just go around and take pictures of the graffiti before it gets erased? I mean, graffiti erasure is like the most productive aspect of city government as far as I can tell. My alley got sprayed this spring and it was gone before noon. I don't think I could get the police to my house that fast if my house got robbed. But anyway, it turns out to be really fun. There's lots of really interesting graffiti specifically around this campus. And by the way, this is not the slacker student. This is like the very best student I've ever had. She and I got really interested in playing this game, and we would compete with each other to see who could find stuff the fastest. And she would bring it in and show it off and say, look what I found. And the game, what it does is just take something that's very ephemeral and puts it on the map and makes it semi-permanent. Software revisions change, and so it's not truly permanent in this sense unless you do something else. And it turns out that this activity was interesting enough for me that I've played this game at least once a month ever since 2010. And I can't say that for any other game. Even Pokemon Go, which had huge, huge numbers, is not as interesting to me now to actually get out and play as it was in the summer. But this game, if I see a new piece of art, I'm opening it up, even if I have to be a little late to the class that I'm taking. And this was the first time that I played an augmented reality game that was sort of fun on its own. Not just because you were a conscripted audience that was supposed to be learning something. And it wasn't just for me. A $1 million grant at UW-Madison based on connecting tech staff and faculty who wanted to do innovative things with teaching around the idea of situated learning, taking learning out of the classroom, used this as their main example. And this sort of, the feature that allowed us to capture images and put them on the map ended up becoming a major part of Eris and actually getting spun off into its own app later. So, like I said, you can be a slacker, have a half-assed idea, and it can go far. as a whole, to try and describe this complicated space that I've sort of set up, we could think about who is doing the designing. We could think about where the learning is supposed to be. And maybe as students of design, you don't care so much about learning because learning is what schools do, but I think learning actually happens everywhere. And most of the things that we're actually interested in doing involve learning in some way or another. So it's not a wholly weird way to think about things. You could think about the constraints of the situation. So like how formal is the situation you're talking about? Mentira was very formal. This is a classroom, this is a game, you have to play, there's a grade. Something like the zoo is not quite informal because there's still that structure and that place around it. Digital graffiti galleries may be all the way over into informal. So when you're thinking about what kind of thing you might be trying to make or what kind of situation or experience you're trying to craft, I like to help narrow things down a little bit in terms of thinking of these various axes. What are you trying to bring into it? Who's doing the design work? And what's that situation you're trying to augment? So, you can't really go a whole lot farther without talking about what augmented reality actually is. And I don't know, everyone familiar with Pokemon Go? So that's a no? No? Okay, I thought maybe this is some sort of weird intersection of subcultures and you all were totally distinct from everyone else I know on the planet Earth. So Pokemon Go is a good example of an augmented reality game, and I'm very thankful for it because my role in trying to teach people how to make these games for the past decade has been kind of like asking someone to make a movie and they've never seen one. So at least now people have seen one movie. At least now people have heard about or played Pokemon Go. But also, if this is a term that you know about other than just for Pokemon Go, augmented reality, there are a lot of other sort of apps and ideas out there that are called augmented reality that I want to kind of lay the groundwork for what that term might mean. Of course, in the end, it doesn't really matter. Make whatever you make and call it whatever you want to call it, and the words might not matter so much. So what can augmented reality be? Let's start with Pokemon Go. In case you have been hiding under that particular rock, the way this piece of software works is you've got a phone with you out in the world, and most of the time you're looking at a map. And that little person up there is where you are in the real world. So that virtual world where there's a Pokemon trainer and you present in the physical world are connected by the magic of GPS coordinates. And then what you see is real water, there's really water there, and there's really roads and really land in the other places. But it's a very highly idealized version of the real world that's present on the screen. And then the other elements that are present on the screen, the blue Pokestops where you get items, and the Pokemon themselves, which are easier to see in this screenshot on the right, have GPS coordinates as if they were in the real world, but they only actually belong to the virtual world. So the way the game works is you go and tap on the Pokemon there, and then you go into another view. This is also called an AR view, or augmented reality view. And here, the joining of the physical and the virtual is the grass and the sidewalk are what the camera sees, and are just broadcast to the screen, and layered over that is Squirtle and anything else. And then you have interactions with that thing. So you flip the little ball up and try and capture Squirtle. So there's this joining of virtual and real worlds that this sort of constitutes the basis of augmented reality. Now the sort of myth I want to dispel is that very often the way the word gets used in the tech press is augmented reality is only used to refer to this business, where you're layering visual fields. What the camera sees and then something that you decide to put on top of that. But Pokemon Go is a good example of maybe that's not the most important thing, even though it makes a cool tech demo. If there are any Pokemon players in the room, do you still have AR turned on? I turned it off on like the first day. Because there's no point to seeing the real world behind that Pokemon, other than for stuff like this, you know, on a Snapchat. It doesn't improve the game, it doesn't make the game more interesting. It doesn't even really give you that verisimilitude of the Pokemon in the real world as much as the GPS map-based part does, at least for me. So when it comes down to it, there's a lot of mechanics of AR. And it's not an exclusive list. So GPS being the other one that Pokemon uses, it uses GPS coordinates to create a link between the virtual world and the physical world of our senses. Other ones that you might be familiar with are QR codes. I mean, you see them on posters and junk like that. I really like them because they're super cheap and easy to prototype with. If you want your phone to know right where this thing is, you just print out a piece of paper and put that there. And that's it. That's all you got to do. Very easy for messing around with this stuff. Other ones that maybe you've heard of are Bluetooth beacons. This is a small Bluetooth transmitter. Very, very low power. So this tiny battery in here will last like a year or something like that, being on the whole time. And the phone can know where it is. So it's another method of location detection. And in fact, there's sort of a three-part version of it. Instead of knowing distance, like you always see with GPS, the Bluetooth beacon will know when I'm within range of it. So like maybe 100 feet or something like that, depending on what intervenes. And then it has sort of a middle distance in terms of the APIs that are easily available. It knows when I'm about this close. And then it can also know the difference when I'm touching it right there. So unlike QR codes, you can hide these. And they sort of become the thing itself. And so you can do indoor location detection or discovery of items and things like that in a way that's not possible with QR codes and also not possible with GPS because it's not precise enough. Another one that's very common with apps that call themselves AR is image recognition. So instead of recognizing a QR code, your app might recognize a picture of a toilet. And then it could link you to other content the way a QR code does, like opening up a web page. But it can also use that visual frame within the camera's feed and replace it with other media. So Aurasma is probably the most popular AR tool that I know of. People use it to make like Harry Potter photos. You know, it's a still photo, but then when you hold your camera in front of it, it moves all of a sudden. Or to place 3D models in the visual feed. In the end, it doesn't matter what these mechanics are. All these mechanics serve to do the same thing in the name of augmenting reality. It connects a virtual world to a physical world. And by doing so, it creates a kind of virtual world that's very different than the virtual worlds we're used to playing on computers and on our couches. There are these virtual worlds that we somehow interact with our whole physical body, or being out in the world, or seeing things. And so it's a tremendous space to explore. And the other thing that's really neat about it, as someone who's exploring it as someone without any money or any art talent or being a programmer, is that I can rely on the graphical quality, the 10 billion p or whatever, of the real world. I don't have to focus a player's attention on the phone. The phone just has to connect them to it. So that's the definition of AR that I wanted to share with you. AR is any time that you're combining a virtual space with a physical and social place. And I think is most useful when what you are creating, you would rightly describe in some sense as a world that contains both of these elements. That's hybridized in this way. But to move beyond like the mechanics that instantiate AR, I want to think about like the social end of things. Like when you create something, the dynamics that it elicits. So when Pokemon Go first came out, I started seeing in my Facebook feed and on news reports everywhere all this stuff about like people finding dead bodies or falling off cliffs or stuff like that. They weren't talking about like, was Squirtle hard to find? They were talking about the consequences in the real world of people playing these games. And an example of how you might do that, like to think about how that gets designed in and is not just sort of an artifact of like a whole bunch of people doing something, you could think about the lure. So for people who are not familiar with Pokemon, the lure is something that you attach to one of these Pokestops where you get important items. And it creates this beautiful cherry blossom kind of thing around it visually, but that's not why you do it. The reason why you put it on there is for half an hour, it attracts Pokemon, special Pokemon, to that place. And so what this says, so that's what the lure does as a mechanic. But what its meaning is, and I don't know if anyone recognizes that map right there, but its meaning says, come hang out. I was around here this summer when Pokemon was going strong, and the duck pond, 7:30 p.m. on a Tuesday night in the summer, one of the deadest places I'm used to experiencing from my tenure here as a person, not just as a professor, but growing up as a kid. Duck pond's usually dead, and it was just full of people every night, like 100 people, and it's because of these lures. So this lure, this mechanic, ends up having a verb in the real world, which is come hang out, which is kind of neat. A lot of people have worked very hard to get people to hang out at UNM, not to just take classes here and go home. And Niantic wasn't even really trying, and they did it, at least for a few months. So this gets back to the idea of place and why I think AR is important. Not just because of sort of the interest in exploring these new game mechanics that create these new kinds of virtual worlds, but because what AR allows us to do is to remediate or change or reinvent the places where we live, work, and play. It gives us new ways to do this. And like is the case with the Spanish class, where if you think about it for a second, the class is this pale imitation of what learning in the real world could and should look like. That's the way a lot of things are. We spend a lot of time inside because that's where like the chairs and the computers are. And because that's how we've organized things, because that's the way it's been for the last 100 years. But one of the really fantastic things about these devices, one of the potentials it gives us, is to be able to do those things, not just anywhere, but in the places where they matter. And a lot of times, this ends up not just being sort of a matter of convenience, but a way to take something that once you distill it and put it in a classroom or something like that, is an abstract idea. But when it's back out and it's in the real world where the experience is a part of it, it becomes a concrete lived reality. It becomes so much more meaningful to us. So AR can unhide the world. It allows us to juxtapose realities, gives us new ways to play in places. I don't know if any of you have played the Humans vs. Zombies game that they do here every year. But that's a good example of how you could turn something like UNM campus into a playground. It's a fantastic playground. I know I've been playing here my whole life, but most people don't play on it. It gives you a chance to inhabit perspectives. One of the ones that gets brought up when we talk to people about these things is a perspective of an architect, let's say. Architects see buildings and see the built environment in a very different way than lay people do. And well, one way to share that is to say, go to architecture school. But another way might be to take that perspective and can some small part of it and give it a reason to exist, the kinds of things, the trappings that you're used to in games. You inhabit a role, you have goals that take place in this virtual world, and the power that you might be given in this specific game is to see the world the way an architect does. And ultimately, we have a chance to share experiences that might be hard to share otherwise. Something to remember, though, after I spend all this time flashing around the phone and the Bluetooth beacons and junk like that, is augmented reality, just like all of our technologies, isn't new. It's new in the sense that it's different than before, but we've always used technologies to think, to share experiences, and also to augment reality. The one in this picture is the topographical map. On a hike in Utah, this topographical map helps us navigate, explore, understand this place that we were in. This is my friend Neil. In a way that we wouldn't, in ways of communicating that go beyond the forms that are handed down to us from the worlds that we live in, and pick up others. So like I do, normal academic writing, but I also publish things that are freely available. So this is published by ETC Press. There's PDFs available on their website. It's published under a Creative Commons license. And if you want a paper copy, it's like $20. Very different from this article, which you probably have to pay $30 just to read one article, if you do it the legit way. Also, I think this is readable by normal people who might be interested in making mobile games. It doesn't have a lot of the sort of formality and structure that's so off-putting in academic writing. But I also write writing that's even more fungible. I blog a lot about this work. I spend a lot of my week responding to people who, like yourselves, maybe heard about this, got interested, and then got started and got stuck and have some technical questions. Or maybe they're like, well, how do I use this if I can't get the internet? Or maybe they're just like, hey, this is a great idea. Does anyone else want to try this? Communication among the people directly who are trying to do this in a very informal and immediate sort of fashion is very important. These are the other bootstraps that will help pull people up. And then very locally, I pulled together some sort of organization to support people like you who happen to be near here, and we can bring our experiences together and do something real. Maybe not something as big as a place like MIT might be able to do, but still something real without any of the usual trappings. We don't need grants, we don't need funding, let's just make stuff. And the resources we do need, we'll find a way to provide for each other. So there's a student group called Local Games Lab ABQ, and they have weekly meetings, Wednesday night, 4:45, usually in the honors forum, sometimes in the sub, and they get together and they talk about video games. Is there anywhere else on campus that people are doing that? I don't know of one. And video games are a huge thing. How can there be nothing without this student group? But there is, and they're there, and you can talk to them. And they even have put on a conference for 3 years in a row, a full day long symposium where they have local game developers and academics and students all together talking about making games. Also, I have a box of iPads. If you want to do some development work, come borrow an iPad from me. Simple things to help get us started. So now you have an idea about what augmented reality games are and might be. Remember, we have these two successes, the Red Winged Blackbird and a digital graffiti gallery, sort of like moments of insight. Like if you think about like film history, like the first time someone did a reverse shot cut. We're starting to get like those moments. What are sort of the possible tools of augmented reality, the moments you can create that are different than other forms of media? And you have a sense of what this overall activity might be, not just the media forms. And it's certainly heavy from my angle as caring about learning, but coming from your own background and your own interests, where you might take that. The last thing I guess I would share with you is just a few more examples of projects or ideas that might help you get going. So let's see if any of these trigger any thoughts for you. So there's of course Mentira, which I told you about, but I want to show you like sort of how the game in the class worked. So we handed out a bunch of iPods to students in the 202 Spanish class, and they started playing in class. And one of the interesting things about the game that allowed them to use Spanish to work with each other is that when you play the game, you pick a role, one of 4 different family members. And depending on which role you choose and how you navigate the conversations, you find out bits and pieces about this murder that other people don't find out about. And so you have to share these ideas with each other in order to figure out who the killer is. Then they would go and play as homework. And this is sort of a funny part of it. We wanted the game to be longer than a field trip, but we wanted the idea of being in a place to still be part of it. And it turns out that a lot of people end up using ARIS and augmented reality, map-based augmented reality in any case, in this exact way, without ever actually going on location. So you would be at home and you would tap on icons on the map as a way to sort of travel to these places and talk to people. And then eventually, students would actually organize in field trips, 5 at a time or so, and go down to Los Griegos and be in a world where they could see some Spanish and sort of feel that Spanish might be around them. Now, it's not exactly a fully immersive study abroad program, but it's a lot more than 202 students usually get. That tiny little toe into an edge of a Spanish-speaking community, and one that's part of their own community, and maybe they didn't realize that yet, is cool to do. And then they would walk around and talk to these virtual people that were set in these real places, and maybe also happen to run into other people on the way there. And then they go back to the classroom and try and work together and try and figure out who the killer was. So that's like how Mentira actually worked over the span of, say, about 3 weeks in this classroom. It gives you an idea of sort of some of the places in which you would be able to set one of these activities. Another one that gives us another sort of golden moment is Dow Day. This was a game first made in 2005, but then I helped port it to Eris when Eris came out in 2010. And the idea is you are at the University of Wisconsin-Madison campus in October 1967 during some particularly heavy anti-war protests. And in particular, the protesters there are riled up about Dow Chemical, maker of napalm and Agent Orange, who is recruiting on campus during 2 particular days in October. And what ended up happening historically is things got sour, things went bad. Bunch of violence, a bunch of people got hurt. Not a pretty couple of days there. And you play a reporter, and you come in and you're talking to people about these protests, both the protesters, the administrators, the police officers, and trying to build a sense of what's going on there. And then the trick about it that makes it augmented reality is you're playing this game in the exact site where all this stuff happened, 40 years ago. And when we show you archival footage or photos, you can see those photos from the exact place that they were shot. And so you can sort of see the past within the present in a way that maybe you wouldn't be able to see in a normal documentary. You can sort of feel like you're there. And so this idea of situating a documentary in place got started with Dow Day, and a lot of people have adapted since then. I talked to you about this earlier project, Partnerships in Indigenous Knowledge and Digital Literacies, and about making this game with these people. So we sat down as people that were very new to each other and worked together to come up with a story for something that would fit into what Eris could do, because that's what we were looking at, but also one that had some fun ideas in it, even poop. And then we got together a few months later and worked with a smaller group of the people who were at that meeting, and also people locally in Fort Mojave, to actually sit down and make this game and set it at a school where people might be able to play it. And just to show you a little bit of how that came out, if this video will play. 2 of the people there, you can see them in the bottom left picture. This is Natalie Diaz. She was one of the participants in the symposium. If you might know her as a writer, she's a fairly well-known writer. And she lived in Fort Mojave and is learning Mojave from one of the last remaining native speakers, Hubert. And what they decided to do for our game was to make a little play and sit it in the game. And since most of the students playing this game would be interested in Mojave, but be native English speakers, they wrote this script in Mojave and spoke Mojave, but subtitled it in English.
Viva Holden, Jacob, Anna Kilian, Amalis, Anna, Aya, Sequel, Sama, Fight and go away, come in. Mara,
Afka.
Wakia, Ukran Biu, out and get home. You begin Jackis Val. Lando, Yamane, Lando, Yamane, Lando, Yamane, Lando, Yamane, Lando, 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 Yamane.
All right, so you can tell from the production that this is not like a advanced set of video editing here, or a complicated shoot. Natalie filmed this on her phone and edited it on our computer with iMovie during the 2 days that we were meeting together to make this game, and we got the prototype done. This script was written, filmed, and is now part of the game that exists. And involved people who are in making, now Natalie's a writer, so she's not a stranger to making things for other people, but people that you might not expect being involved in video game creation. and working together, bring